For our final Hindi na Bagayan episode on challenges to democratic practices in the Philippines, we talked to Dr. Nicole Curato, a sociologist and professor of political sociology at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra, Australia. Here is our full interview.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the last episode of our fourth season of podcasts. In this season, which we call Hindi na Bago Yan, we tackle contemporary issues in Philippine politics and society from a broader historical perspective. So for our final episode, we will be talking about a very important topic, democracy, especially because we just concluded the presidential elections, and we are gearing up for a new administration that will start in June. So we have with us Dr. Nicole Curato from the University of Canberra to talk to us about democratic participation and how we have experienced it and the challenges that we face in the Philippines. So hello, Nicole. Thank you for agreeing to be part of this episode.
Yes, hello, Aaron.
All right. So maybe to start off, many of our listeners may, of course, be very familiar with you and your work. But for those who will be tuning in for the first time, maybe I'll start off by asking you to briefly introduce yourself and your work on democracy and the Philippines.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of political sociology at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. I know our center's name is a mouthful, Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, but I think that name really captures the work that we've been doing, or I personally have been doing for the past 10 years, which is to examine the different ways in which everyday Filipinos can advance principles of inclusive and reasonable discussion, both in our everyday lives and in formal political institutions.
All right. So many buzzwords already in that introduction that we can unpack later on. No? So, but maybe as an introduction to this episode, since we're going to discuss something quite broad, no? Something that we experience on the everyday, no? Yung democracy in the Philippines. Maybe I'd like to first ask for some insights regarding the nature of democracy in the Philippines, because some scholars would often characterize the Philippines as a quote unquote young democracy. What do we mean when we say that a nation state is a young democracy as opposed to a mature democracy?
Yeah, so typically when scholars describe democracy as mature, I'm doing air quotes here since this is a podcast, they refer to democracies where institutions for voice and accountability are consistently strong. So for example, we can expect courts to render judgments in a consistent and timely manner based on laws that the legislature passed, or we expect elections to be consistently held in a free and a competitive manner, or we expect human rights to be upheld equally to all citizens. So when scholars say that the Philippines is a young democracy, it's another way of saying that our country is still trying to work out how to strengthen our institutions for voice and accountability. So obviously the application or implementation of our laws is uneven. Some people get punished for tax evasion while others can just get away with it. Wala akong pinaparinggan, or human rights, it seems, are negotiable. Apparently, pag drug addict or nabansagang komunista, apparently hindi applicable yung human rights minsan in practice. So in that sense, we can say that we are a young democracy in the sense that we are still figuring out the kind of institutions that we want, the kind of institutions that we can build, and the values that we hold dear as our Filipinos. But I think I also want to challenge that a bit, yung description of the Philippines as a young democracy. I think it's valuable to recognize that our democracy is young only if we look at it from a state-centric or institutional perspective. In fact, we can actually say that Filipinos have long embraced democratic practices. So I'm not sure how historians feel about this. So this is my foray into giving a historical example. But for example, the Cartilla or the Code of Ethics of Katipunan emphasizes the virtues of pagkakapantay-pantay or equality or katwiran, which is reason. These are values exactly of deliberative democracy, and these are virtues that are evident in Katipunan's Code of Ethics. So I'm drawing here from the work of Glenn Anthony May, who described Andres Bonifacio to have a consultative approach to warfare, and apparently questions on the right time to declare the revolution was answered through voting after many nights of deliberation. So to me, that is really fascinating. So to quote his work, apparently Katipuneros became revolutionaries only after due deliberation and only because a representative group of them had reached a decision to go to war. So apparently, Bonifacio, as the chair of the assembly or the pulong, even though he put forward arguments that he believes in, he did not steer the discussion to advance his interests or his own views. To me, fascinating na ultimately yung decision-making authority pala in the Katipunan rested not on its leader but with the assembly. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because there is an impression that democracy is a foreign concept imposed on the Philippines. There is an impression, especially now, maybe, that Filipinos are better suited to a dictatorial or authoritarian style of government. But to think of a deliberative revolutionary movement, I think it's inspiring because it reminds us that even in times of crisis, ito na nga, magre-revolution na nga, sometimes we expect our leaders to be decisive, but what the Katipunan tells us, or the lesson that we can learn from the Katipunan, is that we can make the best decisions when we do it together, when we consider different perspectives to inform collective decision-making, instead of relying on the wisdom of a single leader.
Yeah, actually, I really like the way you framed that especially in light of those, of course, the Asian values debate, that would sometimes, I dare say, exoticize the experience of Asians and Eastern societies, diba? Actually, when I was still teaching history in the Philippines, I would always also think of it that way, even before colonialism in the pre-colonial barangay. The dato's power is always negotiated. It's not absolute. So I've always tiptoed around anachronism by dropping words like this is somewhat democratic, So I think it's a very important point to make that it's not entirely a Western, it's not alien to our culture.
Mm.
But I'd like to dovetail with that discussion with the thought of liberal democracy, because sometimes when we discuss the experience of the Philippines with democracy in contemporary conditions, we sometimes binabangga natin siya doon sa liberal democratic framework, 'di ba? So pagka ganun yung framework natin, how would you describe Philippine democracy then?
Yeah, I think with that question, what I would always do is to disaggregate what we mean by democracy. Kasi nga parang na-associate yung democracy with a particular form of government. And then it's easy to say na hindi naman nakakain yan, di ba? Hindi naman siya nakaka-solve ng kahirapan. So walang pakialam yung mga tao sa democracy. But if we try to be more specific or precise in our thinking, and we start thinking about democratic practices or democratic discourses, I could honestly say that I think democratic practices are very much valued by everyday Filipinos. So for example, if I draw from my own work, I see people's appreciation for democratic practices that seriously consider people's voices. So for example, my colleagues and I went to Marawi for fieldwork. We heard internally displaced communities from the Marawi siege complaining that they were not consulted about Marawi rehabilitation. They protest the injustice of being left out of decision-making on policies that affect their lives. In my work on post-disaster rehabilitation in Tacloban, my research participants felt insulted when the government just imposed no-build zone policy without even listening to the considerations of people who lived in disaster-prone areas for decades. In my work with Bianca Franco on the drug war, we heard people from communities who witnessed drug-related killings. We heard their stories that while they appreciate the drug war because it brought peace and order to their community, they're not in favor of Tokhang because they felt that people who got killed did not have the chance to defend themselves. In other words, hindi daw patas yung laban. So when I think back on these experiences, talking to various communities in the Philippines, I rarely hear the word democracy, due process, or human rights, which are principles associated to liberal democracy. But their demands for democratic practices or virtues of voice, fairness, and accountability, these demands were resonant. So I really would hesitate to say that Filipinos don't care about democracy. We just have very different articulations of what we value. But if we reflect on these stories, then I think Filipinos do care about liberal values.
All right. Now, so as you mentioned in your work, you've tackled extensively these ideas of democratic practices, diba? No, so but maybe to just introduce us better to this idea, because sometimes it's very difficult to also always remind ourselves that, and maybe for our audience this is true as well, that democratic participation, for example, is not always only confined to casting a vote during a formal elections, that democratic practices move beyond this exercise, di ba? So ano pa ba yung mga spaces na tinutukoy natin pag sinabi natin na democratic practices? How can citizens of a nation engage more meaningfully in a democracy?
So I think dito huhugot ako dun sa work namin on deliberative democracy. So like what you said, when we talk about democracy, it's not limited to casting a ballot every 3 or 6 years. Deliberative democracy actually asserts that we need to build a democracy where we make decisions together based on inclusive and reasonable discussion. So yun yung aspiration. And obviously, our society is far from that ideal. So usually, sanay tayo na our leaders make decisions based on their self-interest, so hindi naman inclusive. Or even when we think about voting, as voters, we make decisions sometimes based on disinformation or sometimes based on hyper-partisan content that we see on our news feeds. So we don't really make decisions based on good reason. So I think yung question nga is, how can we make deliberative democracy not just as an aspiration, but as a plausible political project? Now, how can we build a society where we can make decisions together based on inclusive and reasonable discussion? And so this has been the puzzle for many scholars these days. And actually, I'm very proud to bring in my work in the Philippines here. Parati kong pinagmamalaki sa colleagues ko na yung 1987 Constitution ng Pilipinas is really deliberative in character. So for example, the 1987 Constitution, let me just pull my notes. So for example, the 1987 Constitution guarantees the right of the people and other organizations to be effective and reasonable participate. Let me repeat that. So in our 1987 Constitution, we have guarantees for the right of the people and other organizations to effective and reasonable participation at all levels of social, political, and economic decision-making. Our Constitution also in principle hints at workplace democracy. I think that's really progressive, that our workers have a constitutionally enshrined right to, and I quote, participate in policy and decision-making processes affecting their rights and benefits as may be provided by law. Sobrang ganda, di ba? Na parang yung iba kong colleagues na iinggit na parang, wow, merong ganyang constitutionally enshrined right sa Pilipinas para makaparticipate sa deliberation yung mga ordinaryong tao. So I think the point is, in principle, we have provisions for deliberative democracy to thrive in our country, that we actually have a right to be heard before our LGUs, for example, make decisions. Our democracy is not just limited to electoral democracy, but also direct and deliberative participation of ordinary citizens. But unfortunately, these principles are only in paper. Practice is a different story. But I think the point I want to emphasize here, especially since there are speculations that the 1987 Constitution might be changed given the current administration or the incoming administration. I think maybe this is my way of appealing for your listeners to appreciate how beautifully written the 1987 Constitution is, how progressive it is, how world-leading it is. And I hope we just work harder in implementing these principles, in putting them to practice.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the 1987 Constitution holds so much promise that is yet to be really fully, realized in the Philippines. So, since you mentioned that we are going into a new administration, diba? I'd like to maybe, before we go into that, go back to the last 6 years of the Duterte administration, diba? Kasi some scholars would characterize this period as the Philippines being placed in a global trend of democratic backsliding, diba? No? So, I'd like to ask you, since you're working on deliberative democracy, in a general sense, in the Philippines, what are the challenges being faced by Filipinos in terms of having a more robust deliberative democracy?
I think yung challenge ng deliberative democracy sa Pilipinas is a challenge shared around the world. So for me, the biggest constraint on deliberative democracy or democratic participation is bigger than the Duterte administration, is bigger than the Marcos administration. The biggest constraint is a marketized public sphere. And yun nga, this is not unique to the Philippines. We live in a society where public deliberation takes place in a privatized public sphere. So of course, social media comes to mind, right? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. These are platforms where political conversations take place, but these platforms are not designed for political conversation. These platforms are commercial platforms, meaning our public sphere is a commercial sphere. So there is incentive to be confrontational, aggressive, inflammatory. There is incentive for cancel culture, kuyog culture, clapback culture, because these are the kinds of content that go viral. And when content goes viral, there's more advertising money. The content creator is encouraged to do that because there's more money. Tech platform receives more money when there are more eyeballs. So I think that is the threat. We are engaging in democratic discourse in commercialized platforms. But if we think about it, especially in the context of the Philippines, this is not really new. If we think about the return of the free press after the dictatorship, the return of the free press is also marked by the return of the elite ownership of media companies. So typically we talk about political dynasties, but as Ana Cristina Pertiara puts it, we also have media dynasties in the Philippines. Our media system has been commercially driven by a few families then. And it's not surprising that there are pressures for some journalists, not all of course, but some journalists to engage in sensational reporting to meet the demands of a competitive market. So this places media integrity on the spotlight. So magugulat pa ba tayo na nagde-decline yung trust ng public sa media, whereas for the longest time, the way our media system is organized in the Philippines was really set up in a way that has tensions with democracy, di ba? Hindi na rin bago yung concept ng hindi na rin bago yung concept ng envelopmental journalism, yung naglalagay sa mga broadcasters para pabanguhin yung pangalan ng ibang negosyo or ng ibang politiko. So, what does this tell us? I think this tells us that democratic participation cannot thrive if our information ecosystem is held together by commercial logics. So going back to the political project of building a deliberative democracy, I think the challenge for us is to create alternative spaces for reasonable discussion where virtues of open-mindedness, reflection, slow thinking, and empathetic understanding are rewarded. Kasi yung environment natin ngayon for communication, these values are not rewarded. Nuanced thinking or arguing with a lot of caveats and a lot of nuance is not rewarded. So sabihin lang sa'yo, oh, wala ka namang prinsipyo. If you change your mind because you encountered a better argument or you encountered new evidence, sasabihin sa'yo, parang ang duwag mo naman, paiba-iba ka ng isip, di ba? So I think we have to also work hard in rebuilding our information ecosystem. And that problem really predates contemporary strongmen.
So, given that idea that yung patronistic na character nagpo-permeate siya beyond politics but also in the information system that we live in, diba? Maybe I'd like to also ground the discussion a little bit. This may be a difficult question to ask, but in your work, diba, you've done, as you've mentioned a while ago, you've done work on the drug war, you've done work in post-Haiyan Philippines and how this affected deliberative democracy in the Philippines. Maybe I'd like to ask if you could share some of your insights or some of your conversations with your participants in your research. For example, when someone comes into this deliberative space, I just want to get us a glimpse of ano yung dala-dala nila doon sa space na yon, diba? When they're trying to engage in a deliberative democratic practice, diba? Kasi I'm fascinated with Wataru Kosaka's work on moral politics, diba? So can you share paano pagka ganun, pag yung isang ordinaryong Pilipino ay okay, magpa-participate ako sa political space ito. Paano yung thought processes na nangyayari?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So I'll answer that question by telling a story. So a few years ago, my colleagues and I, so Bianca Franco and Septrin Bads Calamba, organized a deliberative forum on the drug war. So ang ginawa namin, or actually sila, pumunta sila sa isang community sa Quezon City na naka-witness ng maraming cases ng tokhang. In-invite nila yung mga supporters ng tokhang, self-confessed DDS, and yung mga widows ng mga natokhang, widows and mothers ng mga natokhang. I think there were around more or less 20 people. We put them in the same room sa Ateneo para neutral space, para safe space then in a way. We put them together in the same room and then we gave them a common challenge. And the common challenge was, paano natin mai-improve yung security sa barangay natin sa kapakanan ng mga bata. So hindi namin sinabi na tungkol sa drug war yung deliberative forum. Sabi namin, para naman sa security to. Kasi nga baka sobrang divisive if we use the term drug war. So nag-start yung discussion na sobrang tense. Kasi nga bit-bit nila yung kanya-kanyang hindi lang bias, pero yung kanya-kanyang karanasan. So yung mga supporters ng tokhang, inaccuse nila yung mga asawa at mga nanay ng mga natokhang na mga irresponsable na naaasar kami sa inyo kasi yung anak nyo nagbebenta ng drugs, tuloy yung pamilya namin na aalanganin. Naghirap kaming magtrabaho para mapaaral yung anak namin tapos biglang bebentahan lang ng asawa or ng anak mo na drugs. So kaya yan ginagawa ng mga kamag-anak nyo kasi hindi nila kayo mahal. Tapos yung mga nabiktima naman ng tokhang, syempre naasar sila, di ba? Na parang ang tense ng room talaga, na parang masyado naman kayong mapanghusga, nasasaktan yung damdamin namin. So na-stress kami talaga ni Bads tsaka ni Bianca in that forum kasi feeling namin, oh my God, kailangan natin ng bouncer. Pero after a few hours, naggumawa kami ng breakout groups. We asked them to focus on the task. We put people together from different perspectives. yung ending halos nag-iyakan sila, or actually kami rin, kasi nag-sorry yung mga supporters nung Tokhang. Sabi nila, sorry, hinusgahan namin kayo, naintindihan namin ngayon na kaya lang nagbenta ng drugs yung asawa or yung anak nyo kasi sobrang mahal nila kayo. Kailangan nilang magdala ng pagkain gabi-gabi. Yung mga natokhang naman, nag-sorry din sila. Parang sabi nila, sorry, hindi namin masyadong nabantayan yung asawa or yung anak namin. Hindi namin alam na kaya pala kayo galit na galit kasi naaalanganin yung pamilya ninyo. So ano yung point ng story? Yung point ng story is that kung ilalagay natin yung mga Pilipino sa isang space na may chance sila na makinig ng mahinahon, na mag-share ng kanya-kanyang kwento, may chance sila na mas magkakilala sa isa't isa, merong chance na magbago yung isip natin at magkaintindihan tayo. Kaya siguro, advocate talaga ako nung against cancel culture. Kasi ang problema dito is that hindi lang naman moral failings na parang kung sasabihin mo na itong mga taong to judgmental, walang kwentang kausap. I don't think that's a case of moral failing. I think it's a case of wala kasi tayong opportunity for us to clarify our views. So I think yun yung main lesson for a deliberative forum. How can we make these forums the norm than the exception? Yun din yung frustration ko as someone who runs these forums. We've run many of these forums in the past year. I think last year we ran 8 of these forums. Hindi naman sila lahat successful in the sense na nagbago yung isip ng lahat ng tao. Pero yung effect niya parehas all the time. People really learned about each other and realized that we have more similarities than differences. Na yung differences, na-inflate siya kasi naririnig lang natin or nakikilala lang natin yung isa't isa sa social media na hindi naman talaga conducive for this kind of conversation. So I think yun yung for me revealing about these processes na hindi siya moral failing ng iisang tao. It's a failing of the system and we have to change our communicative system.
All right. So I like that framing that it's in the system. No? So maybe to try to wind down the conversation pero medyo politically loaded pa rin. Kasi I'd like to go now to the recently concluded presidential elections. Diba? No? So first off, maybe I'd like to ask you for your assessment, if you may. Kasi, di ba, the last campaign period and the elections, we've seen so much division being created, di ba? And harsh words were thrown here and there, di ba? No? So, would you say that this election is detrimental to deliberative democracy in the Philippines?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question kasi parang on one hand, I still insist on the answer na it's the context that made us vote a certain way, or it's the context that made our society divisive. It's not because we are so different as people. So parang I think the biggest challenge for us now after the 2022 election is how we can talk to each other in a context where our sources of information and our interpretations of reality are worlds apart. So to me, the biggest concern is how can we build solidarities and pursue things that we value as a nation if there is incentive to exaggerate our differences and disseminate the divisive narratives. So I think it's an open question in my field right now. How do we deliberate in a context where people embrace alternative epistemologies? Meaning, how can we engage in projects of political accountability, for example, when court judgments are considered just one of many interpretations of the source of Marcos' wealth? How do we deliberate in a context where the judgment of Swiss courts about the Marcoses' ill-gotten wealth has the same standing as conspiracy theories on Taliano gold? Diba? How can we deliberate in that context? I personally still have no answers to this question, so I appeal to your listeners for us to brainstorm together. So that's my first concern. My second concern is, and this is something that I'm still working out, because I just started looking at the data that we gathered over the campaign period. So basically, my colleague Bianca Franco and I have been interviewing Marcos supporters. And part of the challenge is when we interview them and ask for their reasons why they support Bongbong Marcos, I feel like their answers are reflections of what we call hegemony or common sense. Na parang yung sagot nila, syempre, kasi okay naman si Marcos. O syempre, kasi panahon na nila ngayon. O syempre, kasi bababa yung presyo ng bigas. Yung revealing for me in these interviews is yung syempre, the taken for grantedness, na parang, malamang, Marcos is yung dapat botohin. And mahirap i-unpack. We try to ask questions, we try to ask for justifications, but it has reached the level of common sense to the point that even interrogating the reasons for their support sounds silly. Bakit mo patatanungin? Hindi ba obvious? So yun yung win-workout ko pa ngayon, na ito na ba yung common sense na hindi na siya pwedeng i-unpack. So I don't know if that is something useful for your podcast. Baka meron din kayong answer doon. In the same way na for the longest time, syempre, EDSA, okay, di ba? Hindi mo na yun i-unpack. Syempre, may holiday tayo tuwing February. Syempre, kino-commemorate natin yung imposition ng martial law tuwing September. Of course, we do that. Umabot yun sa level ng common sense. So parang ngayon, nag-iba na yung common sense. So anong gagawin natin sa mundo na yun na pala yung common sense? So yun yung hindi ko pa ma-figure out masyado.
Wow, that's actually fascinating because I've had conversations with friends as well. I've even used the word na it's almost a priori to them. Na parang hindi na nga common sense yung ginamit ko. Parang a priori na sa kanila na parang no, BBM is the way to go. Na, alam mo yun na parang it's not up for discussion. So that's a very interesting phenomenon to unpack really, no? So maybe just to end our conversation now, I'll try to circle back to the first question that I asked you and some of your insights that you shared there. Kasi 'di ba, you mentioned that yung young democracy and mature democracy, air quotes, no, ay something that needs to be really thought out more, 'di ba? Kasi in your work as well, excuse me, in your work as well, you've characterized the literature on democracy in the Philippines as some scholars would try to focus on the deficit side of it. Diba? Yung pagiging cacique democracy or yung ilustrado politics or patron-client relationship and how these have thrived throughout our history. So now that we are moving forward with the new administration, with all the challenges that we've talked about, and some people would call it the threat of a Marcos presidency in terms of them trying to revise history and change the narrative about the dictatorship. And overall, maybe a challenge to democracy in general. Some people would go that far. How can we remain hopeful about deliberative democracy in the Philippines?
I think the hope rests in the creativity of Filipinos creating a shared story that we can all believe in. So I think if there is one lesson that we can learn from the success of the Marcos Duterte campaign, it's that they were able to give a compelling story that many people thought was appealing. So now the burden is on Democrats, basically. What's on the table? Anong kwento ng lipunan yung gusto mong paniwalaan ng mas nakararami na appealing sa kanila? Kung hindi tayo masaya sa kwento ng mga Marcos at ng mga Duterte, anong kwento yung magiging proud tayo na ikwento sa mga susunod na henerasyon? So I think hindi lang pwede na negatively framed yung mga kwento natin na wag Marcos, wag Duterte kasi ganito. Ano yung alternative? Ano yung mas magandang kwento? And I think dito na papasok yung kahalagahan ng hindi lang teachers, hindi lang mga artists, pero aminin na natin, content creators, the creatives on TikTok, advertising executives, we are really relying on our creative class to construct these stories. And I think my appeal is, as we construct these stories, the construction should also be deliberative. Ibig sabihin, dapat maging komportable rin tayo na isama dun sa kwento yung mga imperfections ng democracy natin, ano yung limits, ano yung open questions. So sana yung story din natin is open-ended, meaning pakiramdam ng nakikinig, kaya din niyang mag-ambag dun sa kwento na yon, kaya din niyang i-extend. Creative actor din siya dun sa kwento na yon, hindi lang siya audience or recipient ng kwento na yon. So yun, so I think we still have a lot to figure out, but I can say that this is also a very exciting time kasi nga open-ended yung kwento. So hindi siya depressing after all.
Yeah, I agree. So sometimes I think about it like in a system that really is against us. Sometimes we need to remind ourselves of our agency to really power through and create more deliberative spaces for the Philippines. All right, so I think with that, we can end this conversation. Thank you, Nicole, for agreeing. Maybe you'd like to share some or promote some of your work to our listeners or social media handles where they can follow you and reach you.
Okay. Wow, sobrang showbiz. I'm just on Twitter at Nicole Corrado. Wala pa akong Instagram.
All right. Thank you, Nicole.
We would like to thank Nicole for generously lending us her expertise and guesting in the final episode of Hindi na Bago Yan. Our next season is just around the corner. Thank you for being with us this season, and you will hear again from us very soon. For now, stay safe and have a good day.